So I'm Liz Donnelly, and welcome to our What's Your WETplan workshop, or learning about when the junior neighborhood lakes and ponds. This is our brand new logo. If you have any suggestions or anything about it, let us know now. We haven't finalized it. This is the first public showing of it. And if I do this right, these are our partners for today's workshop, and we're doing a similar workshop next Friday afternoon, that's in the spring. And now I'm going to hand it over to Lisa Beaver, who's director of the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program, the logo up in the upper left of the vehicle.
Well, welcome everyone. It's so fun to see you all here and talk about native plants and neighborhood and all sorts of good stuff. Well, I am Lisa Beaver, and I'm with the Charlotte Harbor National Estuary Program. And just a little advertisement, a little bit about us. We're one of 28 national estuary programs in the nation and one of 4 in Florida. And national estuary programs are created under the Clean Water Act. So we receive federal funding, but we're really a partnership program. Our study area covers 8 basins, from the Estero Bay Basin north to Lakeland and Winter Haven and the north part of the Peace River Basin and up to Venice. And how many of you live in a watershed? Oh gosh, that's a trick question. We all live in a watershed. Yeah. Exactly. And this is our study area in relationship to the topography, and we're kind of in a bowl. It's a real flat bowl, so that our watershed boundaries tend to move around depending on where the cloud happens to be raining at the time. And that's just one of the things we deal with living in Southwest Florida. And in relationship to our study area, the star is where we're sitting at right now. And so we're right now in the Caloosahatchee Basin. Can any of you name the basins that you live in? Estero Bay Basin or Caloosahatchee Basin? Anybody?
Caloosahatchee.
Yeah, okay, great. So this is a graphic that shows our salinity in our estuaries by month. You know, you see the months changing in the lower left. The redder the color, the more fresh the water is. We use red for fresh water because our fresh water carries the tannins, and it looks kind of tea-colored when it's healthy. And so you can see in the dry season it becomes more blue, and in the wet season it becomes more red. And that flow of water into the estuary is the breath of life to the estuary. And it's that dynamic quality that makes an estuary such a special place. And it's that flow of water over the watershed. You know, having good, healthy flows at the right timing is what makes a healthy estuary. Based on Section 320 of the Clean Water Act, we all convene a management conference. Every entity has a management conference. And ours is arranged with a committee of technical people, including scientists, engineers, and planners, providing advice and recommendations, a committee of citizens and public agency outreach specialists that make up our Citizen Advisory Committee. They give recommendations, and then a committee of resource managers. And all 3 committees give recommendations to a policy committee of elected officials and top agency heads, city councilmen, county commissioners, and top agency heads with Department of Environmental Protection and so forth. And by the time it gets to them, our recommendations are really solid because it's had a chance to be reviewed by citizens, reasonableness, and scientists to make sure that they're consistent with scientific findings and scientifically based. And, of course, there are real people behind each of these committees. And it's that partnership that makes an NEP really special. And we can all put our heads together and come up with the best decision-making. And, in fact, all of you are eligible to be nominated for the Citizen Advisory Committee if you are interested in participating with us in a more full way. We meet about once every quarter and receive presentations of the latest scientific findings and get tied in with tours and so forth. Every NEP adopts a comprehensive conservation management plan, and of course this is a federal thing. We call it a CCMP instead of plan, but every NEP has a CCMP, And ours was adopted in 2000, and we've updated it a couple times since then, so we keep it really fresh and the latest information is folded into it. And we have 4 issues that we look at primarily. Hydrology, that is the flow of water across the landscape and the timing of that. Water quality, fish and wildlife habitat, and stewardship. And what you're doing here is part of stewardship. We have a lot of different, 64 different actions that we focus our efforts on, including implementing projects to improve water quality. And this is a picture of a stormwater pond, and it's managed really well. And of course, the community here uses their stormwater pond as a big amenity in their neighborhood. In fact, they have boats on it, and it's good, clean water. And so this is what flows into Pathway Creek. And so that's just a little taste of what the National Estuary Program is and why we've got such an interest in the work that you're looking at doing. So I'll change this.
Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody. What a wonderful way to spend the day, showing our love for our backyards, right? We have a series of presenters today. Our first one up is Karen Bickford with Lee County Department of Natural Resources.
Okay, so again, I'm Karen Bickford with Lee County Natural Resources. I'm a water quality projects manager for the county. I'm working with some volunteer organizations locally affiliated with the Pond Watch program in order to do some pond, basically remediation type projects, including aerators into the pond systems to see if we can get them to be less green, less turbid, a little bit more functioning with macrophyte or emergent aquatic vegetation. So with that, let's dive into ponds. No pun intended. Everybody lives on the water. Whether you live in Lehigh Acres and you think that you don't really live on the water, you really do. What this map graphic shows is all of the stormwater retention and detention ponds in Lee County, all the little yellow dots. And prior to all of the grid lines that you see that are roadways and all the little yellow detention or the little retention and detention ponds that you see, it was a landscape more resembling cypress domes that you see as you're driving across the state to Miami, or the landscape out in Lehigh Acres with a lot of live oaks. There was a lot of sheet flow, and it was a very wet landscape prior to us coming here and altering it quite significantly. So all that water had to go somewhere, and we, being very innovative people came up with the idea that, well, why don't we just pond it, store it on site, and, we'll do this incrementally. We'll hold the water away from certain parts of the landscape so that we can live on it. And we did a great job. But the unfortunate problem is that there was the unintended consequence of what those ponds look like after a while when they don't really have any good function left in them because they've stopped functioning due to too much pollution. Maybe their morphology, maybe the way that they're built in the first place did not make them, very functional as far as being able to assimilate nutrients and other things in the environment that occur naturally anyways. Because nutrients occur in water bodies naturally, and that's how you get the whole food web. You get the phytoplankton, you get the fish, and so on. You have to have nutrients in the system, but too much nutrients causes some impacts that are very undesirable. So we're going to watch a little video that demonstrates how we all live on the water. Okay, so, I mentioned that naturally, nutrients do occur in watersheds. It's part of the natural cycle of things. It's what drives the food chain and we need it, but at the same time, too much can be it can create undesirable consequences. So what are the inputs and outputs of pond systems? Because pond systems are just like the human body. Let's make an analogy to that. You have to eat in order to be able to move and to, exist, and all of your bodily functions have to be driven by some kind of fuel. Well, the food is the input. The output is exercise or breathing or, basically cell reproduction. So with ponds, being the system that they are, they have to have inputs to function properly, and they have outputs, and if they're not functioning properly, the outputs are pretty ugly. So examples of inputs that go into ponds, whether or not they're healthy inputs or not healthy inputs, are things such as failing septic tank leachate or irrigation that happens to incidentally run into ponds, domestic animal waste, herbicides, fertilizers, plant trimmings, clippings, pool pumping, you name it. Anything that you do in your yard can have a consequence. And so basically the point of the workshop today is to let you know what those things are and then how to basically minimize your footprint. The outputs, when they're not healthy inputs to begin with, you'll end up with things like trash. Trash can be an input and an output all at the same time. Low dissolved oxygen. If the dissolved oxygen in a pond is too low, you might have fish kills. Invasive exotic fish species, because they're just more tolerant than the native species, so they're going to live in places where the native fish can't live. Bad algae blooms. And there's a difference between bad algae and good algae. We're going to go into that a lot later in the session, but there are such things as bad algae and good algae. And then a better balance, when your inputs are not bad inputs and they're not excessive inputs, are things like native plants, littoral plantings, emergent vegetation, higher dissolved oxygen. I wouldn't say high dissolved oxygen. I'd say something that's a healthy level of dissolved oxygen. Because high dissolved oxygen can also be a sign of high respiration, which is not necessarily a good thing. Native fish and good species of algae that are more desirable and indicative of a healthy system. Pop quiz.
All right, let's do this. The pop quiz, first quiz, everybody. Now, we decided to make this interactive because it's not just talking heads. We're going to make it interactive. We wanted to make sure you grab some of this. For that, we have these questions. And as we go with the questions, we're going to reward you for raising your hand and giving me the answer. Whether it's right or wrong, you still get a prize, okay? So the first question is, name one input that you are aware that you're...
Wait, this has to be for the right answer.
Oh, really?
Yes.
All right, for the right answer then.
For the right answer. We'll give a consolation.
Well, that's iffy too, because sometimes the right answer and wrong answer. Well, we'll see that. We'll see. Regardless, we have prizes here. So, let's start with the first one. Okay, an input. What is mention an input? Yes, sir.
Rain.
Rain. What do you say? Yes, absolutely. Rain gauge for you. Another one. Any other input? Come on, guys. Fertilizer. Who said that? Yes, sir. What do you want?
Irrigation over here.
Irrigation, fertilizer. We're giving this as a...
So these are buy one, get one for Organic Lee, which is a great fertilizer. Oh,
well, give me the answer. Dumping the pool. She got it right there. All right. Okay, more questions. Okay, what is a good input in there? Because we said the pool is bad water, too much fertilizer is bad. Okay, so good input. Native plant, excellent. So we have a native plant as a part of an input.
That gets a T-shirt.
Oh, that's a T-shirt. Ooh, and it's an extra large T-shirt. Ah, that's even better. You also get a prize there. No, she knows this stuff. Okay, one last one and move on because we want to keep everything rolling then. So now name some input that you can control.
Good job. Two over here. Fertilizer.
Two over there. Fertilizers. And you said dog? Dog waste?
And fertilizer.
Absolutely. Yes. All right. With that in mind, so keep yourself active. We're going to go back again into another series of questions. So we continue.
Yeah, we continue. Thank you. Great. Good job, everybody. So, to give more examples of inputs, just to drive the point home. You might see some of these strange things going on in your neighborhood once in a while, piping going out of somebody's pool and into the retention pond. Well, that's actually not legal. You're not supposed to do that. Lots of people think that that's okay, but you're really not supposed to do it. Another good example is like gray water discharges. I think there's another slide in here that has that. But, yard waste that's not properly contained. When people throw their grass clippings into their retention pond or they throw it into the canal, don't do that. That's a form of pollution. It gets really nasty after a while, and it does accumulate, and it creates sediments and muck. And, of course, the fertilizer, the domestic animals. Oh, and the one up in the top right corner. Sometimes people are not vigilant about containing their oil waste. In addition to being a pollutant, it's also a toxic pollutant. It can hurt you. So, yeah, you don't want that in anywhere. You want to keep that contained. Good place to remove and contain that, or a good place to take that is hazardous household waste or to an auto supply store that they will take it. The top left picture is a breached septic tank. Yeah, that happens once in a while. That's a bad one. The bottom left is a gray water discharge. That's a pipe running from someone's dishwasher or washing machine going out into the stormwater system. Yeah, you're not supposed to do that either. Top right picture is, it's just basic erosion, and it's because, do you notice anything missing on that shoreline? Plants, right, okay. Yeah, so that's what happens when you have too much wave action, too much wind action, and no plants on the shoreline. And then the bottom right is, and you'll see this quite often, it's just grass clippings. It seems really innocuous, but that is a major source of pollution that people really don't realize. And it's one of those things that, you see it every day, but you don't think about it being a problem until somebody points it out, and then you understand. But again, there's inputs and then there's outputs, and you have to decide on a day-to-day basis for yourself what kind of result you want to get. If you want to get a good result, you just have to be very mindful about how you're interacting with the environment in your yard. Another pop quiz.
Come on here, let me take that microphone. Okay, now so you know about it. Well, the output is obviously things that come out of the pond. Now I want you to tell me some of those. So pop some of those answers, please. Any output, name an output from your pond. What comes out of your pond? I know it's a tough one. Ooh, we're scared. Somebody from here? Nobody? Come on, anybody. What comes out of the pond? Okay, let me give you a hint. It rains a lot, so we're going to have something coming out of the water. I already said it. Water comes out of your pond. Overflown water goes into the dishes, just like the duckies. It goes all the way down into the river and eventually into the bay. What is that? Oh, there the answers are over there. All righty. So now tell me a good output. How about it's tougher now? A good output. What would be good in this case? Fish, good. Give her one. Fish, because if you improve the quality of the fish, of the water, the quality in the pond, yes, you're improving nature. You put in the little fish, and the fish will be a bigger one, and then the rest, the birds and all the other stuff will be all joining. So yeah, that's a good output. You have another answer? Oh, who had an answer? Littoral, yeah, absolutely. Littorals will definitely help enhance the wildlife. So yes, it is an output. Besides the aesthetic of the pond, for crying out loud, if you have a nice, beautiful lawn, people will say, "Oh, nice pond." It's a whole expression. Like it's a nice place to live. Last, name one output that you can control now. Something that comes out of the pond that you can actually control. Oh, she wants a prize, But Lisa knows that. But go ahead, because, we need to know.
Native plants. That's a good output.
That's something that you can actually control, absolutely. The type of plants, native, and also the amounts around. And not just around the lake or the pond. All the way up to the yard. Behind the house, right in front of the house. Everything is going to run into it.
Output, and it's both. It's input and output. Trash. that you can control.
Yes, absolutely. Give out a prize. You have. But trash is definitely one. Who said that? Yes. Oh, here. Yes, absolutely. Burn. What do you, water? Oh, we also have these posters. Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Ply Butcher poster. Ooh. You want a poster? Oh, he preferred this one instead of the dirt. All right. Continue. And we'll continue more.
And in case you're wondering, well, what do I do with my pool water? You're supposed to let it run over grass and seep slowly into the grass, just in case. You know, not down the storm drain bad. Outputs, the good outputs, the wildlife, just what we were talking about, wildlife. You've got abundant littoral growth. You've got abundant submerged aquatic vegetation down in the lower right corner. You know, you see a lot of vegetation, a lot of wildlife where you have, and clear water. The water should not be turbid. It should not be green. It should be clear, but tannic, because that's what the water is around here. It's tannic. Those are good outputs. Those are healthy signs. Bad outputs, the bad and the ugly outputs. Upper right corner is a major algae bloom. It's it's just that pond is completely loaded. You can't even really see water aside from the just basic sheen. Lower corner is a lot of trash and a lot of excessive vegetation growth, and of course fish kills. And then that lovely picture of the Caloosahatchee River in the lower right corner, that's a cyanotoxic algae bloom. Those things are really, really bad. They have nervous system consequences. They have hepatotoxic consequences, meaning it'll affect your liver. So you can get from things that are minor inconveniences to things that are really toxic. I mean, downright ugly. So again, the inputs and the outputs, they do have an effect on not just the aesthetics, but your health and, you know, the welfare of the pond overall. So it's a decision. All right. We're going to take a short break and watch a video, but I will take questions.
Okay. I noticed that we have some tilapia starting to invade. How do we control them?
I'm going to defer to Ernesto, but I would say that the tilapia are indicative of water pollution, definitely. But as far as control, what would you say?
Well, it's not so much pollution as it's actually an invader. It's an exotic animal who, you know, obviously is from Africa, and he came here as an exotic. The problem with it is it's overgrowing itself because it's reproducing constantly throughout the whole year. And when we have a cold front, a very nice cold front, it will kill a lot of these fish that are not adapted to. So that's the reason why it should not be here to begin with. How to control it? There is very little to do about unless you go and apply rotenone, which is killing all the fish in there, and that will be the most practical way to sterilize the whole pond. But then that's not right. What people have done in some instances is feeding them in a corner with pellets, you know, either crumbs or something. You're just feeding them and attract them to that, and have somebody who casts net pretty well, and then cast them all at once, and then remove them all. Of course, some of them will escape, but you train them again, and they will come back. And then, but then you train them until you have enough, and you will see them all coming to you, and then you go and cast net them. It's very hard to remove them, but it's definitely one of them. They should be discouraged. If anybody capture them, remove them, absolutely take them, kill them, get them out. Yes, sir.
Some have said that bass are a good counteractant to tilapia.
Oh, yeah. Some people say that bass is a good way to contrast the effect of the tilapia. It's not so true, because actually tilapia is a mouth breather. Actually holds the young ones in their mouth, and by the time they come out of their mouth and they're too big, and the bass will not mess with them. So they are really, really protecting. In fact, you can identify tilapia by having a big, huge crater in the middle, and then the fish will be in the middle, like silly there. But and fish do this nest. The bluegills will do, but you see in the bluegill nest a little more gravel. The tilapia has no gravel whatsoever. It's just a sandy crater in the middle. Nothing, and the tilapia will be in the middle. They're bad. because they will filter, and as they filter, they remove a lot of the zooplankton. And the zooplankton is the one who keeps the algae under control. So if you're removing the zooplankton, algae will be growing and it will be turned more turbid. And turbid is what they like to do because the turbidity in the water will protect the tilapia. So that's like a mechanism of defense, natural mechanism of, and I had enough.
If you ever have any questions, if you ever have any questions about what to do, you see illicit discharges, and by illicit discharges I mean like those gray water pipes and things like that. If you have questions about anything, feel free to call the county. I'm always answering my phone. Even if I don't answer it right away, I will definitely call you back within 24 hours. Thank you.
So isn't that a beautiful video? I mean, when you look at it, it makes you so happy that you live here, whether you live here part-time or full-time residents. I mean, you're like, that's beautiful. That's why I live here. That's what I'm here for. But then if you go back and you think about it, those pictures that Karen is showing is also what we see every day. And that's also what we're doing to everything you saw right there. I've been down here 10 years now as a full-time resident, and it continues to get worse. I do stormwater engineering, and that's what I've done for the past 10 years, and I've worked a lot with municipalities locally and everything, trying to fix the problems that are out there right now. I spend a lot of my job going out and trying to, well, there's algae bloom here, and there's this here, and we're trying to remove nutrients here, and I've done a lot of projects to help clean that up. And it's not getting any better. I mean, we see those beautiful videos, and that's what we want to continue to see here. But unless we make a change, and the change starts with you and everybody here that is interested in making the change, we're not going to have that video for much longer. It's going to be just a video and just a memory of what this area once was. So where does that actually start? There's a lot of things that we do, and Karen already talked about some of them, what are our inputs and everything, but I think one of the biggest things that if you take away one thing from this is fertilizer. We can have a green lawn, and a green lawn's great, and we all want a green lawn because it's absolutely beautiful, and that's also, especially from a lot of us, I assume, are from up north. I think almost everybody in Florida is from up north sooner or later, but that's one of the things that we're used to seeing. We have a green lawn, and yes, it dies off in the winter, but we have snow on top of it. So down here, what a green lawn means to a lot of us also ends up turning into what we would also call a green pond. By not applying the fertilizer correctly, or not paying attention to your fertilizing standards, or applying too much fertilizer because you think you're actually helping your lawn, you're actually putting those discharges into your stormwater pond, which will in effect turn your pond green also with algae. That algae will then also make its way out to the rivers, streams, and eventually out into the Gulf. So some of the key points and key takeaways there are, we never want to fertilize over a storm drain. Big, big no-no. You know that storm drain that's right out in front of your house and you just accidentally ran it over? Don't accidentally run it over. Make sure you try to stay away from it. Also, if you have a lake in your backyard, try to stay at least 10 foot away when you're doing the fertilizer from the lake, because you don't want the lake will rise when we have storm waters, and it'll come and pick up some of that fertilizer. There's different things also. You can buffer some sensitive areas. It would be nice if you could do some nice planting, just like we were talking about the littoral shelves and everything, that will help keep some of that fertilizer, again, away. It'll help capture anything that did happen to run off if there was a storm event, say right after you fertilized. And then especially in the summer, try to refrain from fertilizing. The rainwater we have here, especially in the summer, is just absolutely amazing and does a fantastic job of keeping our grass green and everything during the summer, because there's so much of it. We have tons of rain, so we don't really need to fertilize during the summer because it'll all run off anyway. So the fertilizer isn't going to do any good, except for if you want a nice green pond to match your green lawn. And then I also have here, just as a side note, in the Caloosahatchee Basin, which I think we've identified as what almost everybody here lives in, fertilizer use between 2003 and 2006 increased 62%. So just think of how many extra pollutants we're putting into our water that are kind of making it turn green. So, you had a question?
Yeah, we've heard that leaving a buffer along the edge of the pond is a good thing. By buffer, I mean an area that's maybe 18 to 24 inches wide, just at the edge of the water. And leaving that grass grow, let's say, 8 inches high.
Yes.
Especially during the rainy season. The theory being that you're going to catch a lot of the sheet flow before it goes into the pond. Is that a valid thing to do?
I actually try to keep it at about 10 feet is actually what I would say. But 18 inches is at least a good start. And then also littoral plantings and stuff will help that too. So if you want to get some plantings in there even, so you weren't even mowing during the winter time, that would be even more beneficial. And we'll go over some of the plantings and stuff a little bit later. But there's even plantings that can help. And then it doesn't look like you're not mowing that 2 feet of your yard or whatever else. Because I think what you'll see, especially in some of the residential communities during the summer, is you'll see that water level will probably come up into your yard Approximately, probably about 10 feet, depending on the slopes you have and everything you have up. If you have a very low lake during the summer, it'll come quite a bit back into your yard. So we try to leave a really big buffer in there because during a really wet year, just like last year was a really wet year, that water's going to come quite a bit back into your yard if you have the lake in your backyard.
Do you have any feedback on how high to leave that grass? I'm not familiar with the grass down here. But up north you get grass. Some grasses, when they grow too tall, they throw off seed heads, and they get to be a nasty-looking thing.
It depends what kind of grass you're talking about. You can probably answer this question better, but
They talk about Floratam.
Well, you got to be careful because if you're in a gated community, sometimes you can actually get yourself into a code enforcement issue. They have regulations on how high your grass can be. Now, I say that because just Floratam or regular lawn grass is kind of the issue, but Ernesto can speak to what kind of grasses you could. No. So some sort of vegetative buffer is what is a good thing, but I'll leave that to.
We get a lot of pushback on that.
Yeah.
One of the things is the vendors, once they let the grass grow at a certain height, they've got nothing to cut it with, so they have to hand cut it.
Right.
People walking dogs don't like it because they're afraid of the snakes. So we get a lot of pushback on those buffer zones.
If you can leave me your information before you leave, I will get you a good solid answer on what you can use, and we'll work with you for your community and help you get the information you need for your community. Okay? What we need to do really is focusing on balancing our inputs and outputs. I'm not going to tell you don't fertilize. Well, I might tell you don't fertilize. I prefer you don't fertilize, but you're going to do it anyway. So I'm going to try to help you balance your inputs and outputs because I'm not going to be able to convince all of you not to fertilize your backyards. So I want to start out with there are good and bad outputs. There are things that you can help to do to make it better. And overall, our overriding goal is we just want the system to act more like nature. We can do things that will speed up the process of the inputs that we put in that were higher inputs than nature, such as fertilizer, which is putting higher amounts of nutrients into the water quicker than it would have otherwise. And we can do things that can help speed up the process to get those things back out of the water. So there's a balancing act that you have to do to kind of make it all work out in the end. Unfortunately, there's not enough science yet to make it move fast enough to keep up with what we've been doing to the water. So a lot of these are going to help the situation, but they're not going to fix it. So what does that mean? It means that you're going to have to dredge your pond sooner or later. It's going to happen. No matter how good you think you're being, you're going to have to dredge your pond sooner or later. So there are things that you can do to help to balance it, but science just isn't there yet. If we're going to continue to be humans, and we're going to continue to want green yards, and we're going to continue to put all of the outputs into the water that we put into the water, oil, and you have the guy out, your next door neighbor who's running his gray water out there and everything else, science just isn't there yet to speed up the process fast enough to make your water clean. So we have to try to do the best we can with what we have right now and balance that and eventually dredge our ponds. So this is just going to be a little video just to let you all know about the Lee County Fertilizer Ordinance. And the point of this ordinance is to help balance those inputs, especially during the summer.
Hey Russ, Lee County is sending us on vacation June through September.
Yay, what was the rainy season? So, how about the island?
You know what happens when we get near water.
When it comes to fertilizing your lawn, phosphorus and nitrogen need a summer vacation. So fertilize smart and look for the double zeros when you buy summer fertilizer. It's the law.
How will we ever get through airport security?
Okay, so let's just start with the development alone is going to change the watershed. So just by putting your house out there, even though you're not putting anything directly into the water anymore, you've changed the watershed. You've changed how fast that water runs off of your property. You've changed where the water goes. You've changed everything. Part of what we've done as engineers, which could be good or bad, is we've also put in all of these stormwater ponds. So as you can see on the left, we have 6 Mile Slough over there on the left. in 2002, and on the right we have present day 6 Mile Sloop, present day-ish, sooner or later in time. And you can see that there's a lot of development, the slough has been impacted, and there's a lot of stormwater ponds. The stormwater ponds are helping in the fact that they are decreasing the high peaks of that flow out of the system. It's not decreasing the flow. You've increased the overall amount of water that is going into the slough system. Before, it used to go into the groundwater. It would just sit in those little wetlands, and a lot of it would soak in, and we're increasing the amount that's going out. So now we've gone ahead and we've increased the water that's flowing out. Even if it was perfectly clean water and we didn't do anything to our yards, it's more water. And even from your grass or any plants, even native plants, there are going to be nutrients that are exiting with it. So we're throwing those out there faster. So even if we did the best management practices we absolutely could on our site, we're still polluting the waters more than they were in a natural environment. And so that's just important to understand, that no matter how good of stewards we are, we're still going to have to be cognizant and make sure we're cleaning up our waters. Some of the things that can help when we're doing this are obviously shoreline plantings and everything that we've already talked about. And, sorry, I skipped ahead too much. I'll go, mine are out of order here. That's the problem. So what you can see here is we have two different ponds with different surface areas. The one on the left is much better as far as your shoreline plantings go and everything. You're going to be able to plant a lot more. You're going to help filter a lot of that runoff and everything from your fertilizers and everything as it's getting into the water, because you're able to plant more shoreline. There's just more shoreline there. Another good thing about this pond is you're not going to get the same erosion that you would get in the square pond. With the square pond, you're going to get a lot more erosion because the wind's going to come in and kind of turn up that water a little bit, and it's going to hit that shoreline a little bit harder, and you're going to get more erosion in that one too. And as we said before, erosion is an input. All of that soil carries nutrients, and you're just putting it straight into the water with erosion. So if you can design a pond, because if you want to go design a pond in your backyard, the one on the left is actually going to be a little bit better. So if you live on a pond, if you happen to live on a pond that looks more like that square one of the nice things to do might be to kind of make some changes to the edge of the shoreline to make it look a little bit more natural, because the big thing that we want to do is mimic natural systems. Unfortunately, I think what we found out over time is that humans couldn't design it better than nature. Nature already had it figured out, and a lot of what we're doing right now is going back and changing everything to mimic nature because they really had it figured out. So really what we have to do is figure out how to live with nature instead of going and trying to make this better system, which is the square ponds of the old days. So here's the planting. Sorry, I had jumped ahead a little bit earlier. Here's the planting. So we have a good practice versus a bad practice again here. On the left, you can see we have a lot of littoral plantings and everything. And on the right, there are no littoral plantings except for grass. As we talked about before, with no littoral plantings, there's going to be some more erosion and everything. There's probably a lot of erosion in a lot of your ponds that you've seen from time to time, especially when the water comes down. In the wintertime, we tend to see the erosion pick up and everything just because there's not enough planting to stabilize that soil. And the shoreline even looks better with the plantings, especially when the water stages come down. We tend to start to get a lot of complaints about how people's backyard ponds look during the winter because the water comes so far down and you'll have erosion, or you see a lot of dirt because there's no plantings. But when we have the plantings of the shoreline with the natural vegetation and everything, they tend to be a lot better. People don't even notice that there's dirt under there. And then also what you're getting with this planting here is that planting's helping filter some of the nutrients before it gets into the big part of the water there. So that those plants are picking up some of those nutrients before it's going to go out that outfall structure that is in your pond. Okay, so this one, the one on the bottom, is the bad pond. No, I'm kidding. This is actually the same pond after aerators were installed. So we had aerators and shoreline plantings. So this neighborhood was obviously having a really bad problem here, and they wanted to fix their algae. So what can they do? They obviously had a nutrient problem. One day they will have to dredge. We did not make all of their nutrients go away. There's still nutrients in the water. But one of the things they were able to do to balance this system and speed up the metabolism were to use nutrient uptake and everything. So I think they have mats. Do they have mats in this one, Karen? They have some floating mats out in this pond. And some aerators in the pond, and that's helped circulate everything a little bit better, because part of the problem is once you get one of those algae blooms, they start to kind of block everything out down on the bottom. So the aerators are helping to move that algae a little bit better, get it off of the top so there's more clarity to the plants and everything on the bottom of the lake that are helping to take up those nutrients. And then here's just some other balancing options. Here's what we were talking about with the 10 feet back. You also have in the bottom over there, you have a rain garden type thing. That's just out in front of their house, kind of like a ditch. They wanted to make it pretty though, so there are plants that can be planted that will help with those, remove those nutrients from the water. Even if you just have a regular old swale out in front of your house, you can plant it and make it pretty. It's really, if you put the right plants in it, it's not going to impact the flow of the water, and it's actually going to help clean up the water. So there are options that you can do up there. You always want to try to keep a rain gauge out there, honestly, so you're not overwatering your lawn. Overwatering your lawn can also lead to a lot of runoff, and that runoff is also putting nutrients into the water. You can have a rain barrel, obviously, and then we're doing some littoral plantings, I think, in that picture up on the top right. It's Ernesto's turn. It's the most exciting part.
Do we have this as a prizes too?
Yes.
Check this out. These are the calendars from the Charlotte Harbor NEP. Every year there's this beautiful thing. By the way, if you don't get the newsletter, you don't get the calendar. So if you get the calendar, if you get the newsletter today, you can actually come out of here, and then at the end it tells you where to send your... here's the newsletter, right in the middle of the calendar. All right, so let's go with the questions. Name one action that you can do today to balance your pond inputs and outputs. Yes, sir.
Use the proper fertilization.
Use the proper fertilization. Yes, absolutely.
We have a winner.
Yes.
Littoral plants.
Littoral plants? Absolutely. And those things that you can actually do now. Yes. Another one. Another one?
Aeration.
Put in aeration? Yes, invest in an aeration, yes. Or start saving money for that, because there's another thing there. You were saying? Floating mats? We actually are experimenting on that process. Yeah, so it will be something that we can actually start implanting and implementing maybe when we get the results. But that's an experimental right now. And I tell you the truth. I'm sorry?
What's a floating mat?
You saw that little, it's like a raft, and it's planted with little cups, and the cups are holding water plants. Plants that are actually being able to stand, the roots going to be able to stand in the water. So it is it's another process.
I'll see if during the break I can.
All right. And before I move out of this pop, let me suggest you one thing that you can actually do, because some communities that have been doing is actually educating the rest of the community. The board needs to know about these things. I mean, you guys are representatives. So go and tell the board, hey, we hear some other stuff about this pond. It's not just a water pond, it's not even a lake. It's a pond. It's a stormwater pond. And inform community cohesion. I mean, work together and maybe to have a plan. And that's another thing, a plan. Yes? You want a calendar?
I was just going to put the offer out that if you don't feel comfortable speaking on this topic because you're not familiar with it enough yet, but you're interested in introducing your board to it, we're willing to come speak to your board, do a presentation for them. We'll make it a lot shorter than the workshop, of course. We'll do it however many minutes you think would be appropriate, but we would be more than willing to come in and just introduce them to the topic.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. As a commercial, should I make a commercial? There is a lot of volunteers, and I want to thank all the Pond Watch volunteers who have come here with a lot of knowledge. I mean, it's not just the talking heads here, but among yourself, you have a lot of knowledge in this room. So you just go around, pick their brains, because now there's another knowledge here. Quickly, a habitat for fish enhancement, and this is one brochure that was brought by the fellow here. He actually has information about this, so you can talk to him about this habitat enhancement for the ponds. And I will let you, let me introduce you. Dr. Thomas Surge, FGCU University Professor for Limnology and other ecological studies. He has been invited by us to give us a presentation about the algae. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. I do have an accent.
No.
Yes, I do. So if there is a word you don't understand, you just raise your hand and I'll repeat, okay? All right, so I'm going to talk about the algae, and I'm going to use the analogy with, the good, the bad, and the ugly movie, that Italian Western. And you're going to see first that the good algae is sometimes not the one you think they are. You actually sometimes, here in Florida especially, look at them as bad algae, and sometimes ugly. So, of course, the concept is very, very subjective, and I'm going to try to alleviate the subjectivity and give you objectively what are the good, the bad, and the ugly algae, the one you don't especially want to have. Okay, so what are algae? Anybody knows here? Well, it could be mostly one cell. It could be also a bacteria. You have cyanobacteria called blue-green algae. I'll get to this. We also have algae that can look like plants. Example? Chara. Yeah, Chara is actually, I'll show you some pictures, is actually
Don't answer that. We have a prize.
an alga. All right, and it looks like a plant. It's actually, people think it's one of the primitive plants. And you also have the seaweeds, but we don't have them in our pond. But seaweeds also are algae. So I will mainly focus here on the microalgae, the small ones, okay? And they can sometimes agglomerate and make big mats, so we're going to look at that. But generally, the micro-size algae. All right, so this is microalgae, and as I said, I can differentiate them as different size. All right, so you have the macro, the big algae, and this is Chara. And you have, if you see them in your pond, it means that your pond is very healthy, or quite healthy, because they don't like when the nutrient is too high. They generally don't compete with the other plants. This is an alga, but again, very often pulled together with the plant, even though it is an alga. Then you have the microalgae, the phytoplankton, and also the benthic algae. We'll look at those in a minute. All right, so generally you need a microscope to be able to see them with a naked eye, especially when they're floating or suspended in the water column. All right, and they can be living alone, or they can be also as colonies, so they make chains of algae all together. All right, and they can also make this very nice spatial configuration, as you see here. So they're kind of beautiful. Another one here is a green alga, and this is a cyanobacteria here. So it's a chain of cyanobacteria. So some bacteria can actually do photosynthesis. They don't really have a nucleus like the other algae I showed you, but they can chain together. They're generally very, very small, but then they can also form very, very large mats. All right, so you can also differentiate them by colors. All right, so we have the green algae. All right, and we have the yellow-brown diatom algae, which we call them also glass algae because they have a skeleton made of silica. All right, and you have the red algae, which form also red tide over in the ocean, but you also have them in your pond. Not very many, but you do have them. And the blue-green algae. Okay, so eukaryote means they have a nucleus, and the prokaryote means they don't have a nucleus. They're very primitive, very, very simple. All right, and then you can also differentiate them by location. This is where I want to make sure that I don't lose you here. You have the free-floating or suspended algae, so the planktonic algae. Plankton is, by definition, organism that cannot swim against current. You will be carried away with the current or the wind-generated current in your pond. Okay, and you have the bottom algae. All right, and this is the one generally you have a problem with. So we call them periphyton. So I will refer to this benthic algae as periphyton. Benthic for bottom, it's easy to remember, B, bottom, benthic. And they live on the bottom, and sometimes they can be attached to plants. They can be attached to animals. You have them on sea turtle shells, on turtle shells, not sea turtle. And you can also have them suspended when you have a lot of mixing in your pond. Or they can also float on the surface as mats. They can also be attached on plants, like on Chara. Chara actually love to have these. The algae like to be on Chara, attached to Chara, and they can float on the surface. All right, now the algae, are important. You don't have to remember that equation. I won't have a pop quiz on that equation. Don't worry about it. But they do photosynthesis. So they're beneficial. You need them. And one of the reasons is, they produce oxygen. As you can see here, what you don't want is too many of them because they also respire. All algae and plants respire all the time, and when there is light, they compensate their respiration by producing oxygen, and generally more oxygen than they consume. All right, so they are very important, and they also are very important because they are the base of the food web, or the food chain. Where you want to, we have a food chain. So you have they're called primary producers, also with the plants, okay, and you have grazers that will be eating these algae, and then you have the carnivore 1, 2, and 3, and as you can see, to have a healthy, balanced ecosystem, you need them. You cannot live without them. What you don't want is too many of them, okay. All right, now what controls algae? Why do I say that? Because to be able to understand algae and why they overgrow your pond, you have to understand the ecology, which is what I study. So to grow a healthy algae or a plant, actually, you need light, you need adequate temperature, and light and temperature are kind of linked together because light basically warms up your water. And you have the nutrient, and you have two kinds of nutrients. You have the macronutrients, the ones that are necessary 100%, phosphorus, nitrogen, and actually carbon dioxide, which generally is not missing. And then the micronutrient, for example, potassium, iron, copper, etc. And you don't want them in too high amount because they can be also negative. They can negate the effect of the positive effect of nutrients. And then you also have another thing is a competition. Algae and plants compete all the time. You might not say it because they don't fight like bulls together, but they actually compete. They compete for the nutrient, they compete for the light. Why do I say that? Is because if you actually have a healthy ecosystem, you want these algae and the plants to compete, because when everybody competes, everybody loses energy, right? You're losing energy when you're competing. When you have two boxers on the ring, they're wasting energy. There might be a winner in the end, but you have lost energy to actually be the winner. So when they're competing, you actually have a way to control them at the same time. So the algae and the plant compete with each other. All right. So to have actually a very good balanced ecosystem, you need to have a nutrient loading which must be controlled, and we've seen that. You had quizzes. You mentioned the nutrients. You mentioned the dog waste. Not entering the pond. So we know that. And again, you also want to have your algae compete with each other, but also with the other plants. So a lake devoid of plant generally is not very healthy, because the plant and the algae no longer have the competition going on. And if you only have algae, well, that's good for them. They're wasting less energy to be able to grow, right? And then you want also to have the healthy microcrustaceans, so zooplankton. All right, so these are very small crustaceans that live in the open water, and they feed on these algae. All right, and when you use copper sulfate, for example, the copper sulfate actually has a collateral effect. Everybody knows copper sulfate? All right, okay. So copper sulfate not only kills the algae, but it also collaterally kills what controls the algae, the zooplankton. All right, so if you're killing the zooplankton, you basically are defenseless against the algae, unless you're using copper sulfate. So I very often tell my students it's like a crack addict. It's very cheap, but because you have no other way to control the system, you got to use more and more and more and more, and it's like a downward spiral to generally a dead end. All right, so way to control algae, again, the nutrient, you have the light, you have what we call the bottom-up control, so the nutrient controls the algae, and if you have a lot of nutrients, you generally have a lot of algae, and eventually if you have too many of them, you can pretty much choke your system. Okay, I think you know that. And then you also have the top-down control, so it means that you need also to have a healthy top predator to control your algae. And that's a healthy ecosystem. You need the bottom, you need the top, and you need some nutrient, but not too much. And you need all the different members of that food chain. If I'm going too fast, you tell me, and I gotta slow down. All right, so we're getting to the movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Sergio Leone. You know the tune? Right? All right, so we're going to talk about the good guy. So when you see that icon, Clint Eastwood, that's going to be the good algae. All right, this is the bad and the ugly. And you want to have the good ones. All right, and the good one in Florida, you'll see, are not really the one you think are the good ones. So my main point here, the hard to sell part. It's like a little argument we have together. Is the good algae. All right, the hard sell. All right, so generally, the best algae, the best good algae are the one you cannot see, right? From your perception. So when you have very clear water, nothing on the bottom, it all looks like a glacier lake appearance, you're happy, right? Because that's what a lot of people want here. Why is that? Actually, at WCU, I have a social program, I'm including the social and behavioral sciences, and they're studying the perception of a homeowner to different types of pond and the way they look like. And especially people coming from up north where they have these glacial lakes. When they come down here, they want to have the same lake down in Florida. Turns out it's impossible to have this unless you heavily manage the lake eventually with chemicals. All right? So I understand that you're going down, up north, but it's very different here, and I will explain that. Generally, the glacial lake have a limited amount of nutrients, and also the temperature is lower, so the algae don't grow as fast as the algae down here. And this is the main difference. So they can either tend to be like this or like this, and you're okay with this as well. The water is clear, you don't have a lot of floating mats, you have these nymphea, you're happy. The problem is, in Florida, I don't know if you've seen the change from this slide to this slide, I did change the wording on top. In South Florida, you get actually the good one as the one you can see. Alright? So my goal here is to teach you how to distinguish the good one from the bad one from the ugly one. Because for you guys, they all look like the same, right? Okay. So the one you can see. In the limited nutrient system, alright, where you have basically very little nutrient in the open water, in Florida, especially in limestone-based wetlands or ponds, you will grow this type of algae. When you have limestone in Florida, the limestone basically sequesters most of the phosphorus through chemical reaction. And the system is very little loaded with phosphorus and nitrogen. But despite this, paradoxically, this is what makes the system unique, you have a tremendous amount of algae. Okay, and this is an example here. This is actually a pond on campus where we don't use fertilizer. Alright, and the water is actually low nutrient for this specific pond. And you can see that you have a lot of algae on the bottom here, and eventually they float on the surface. I will explain to you guys why they come up to the surface later. Okay? This is another picture here in the littoral zone, so the shadow part of the pond where you see these algae. And for the most homeowner, they call me and they say, I have an algae problem, I have an algae bloom. And I come to see them and I say, okay, I'm coming. See? Well, it's not an algae bloom. First, because the definition of an algal bloom is, actually I said it in the question. I changed, I didn't say algae bloom, I say alga bloom. Is, for the definition, it's one species. That's a bloom. A species is actually, an algae bloom, or algal bloom actually is one species that will bloom and basically overgrow everything else. This is not actually one alga only. It's actually a healthy community of a ton of different type of algae which cooperate all together like a symbiosis so that they can use a tiny bit amount of nutrient in the water to be able to grow. And it's only because of that cooperation that they actually are able to grow in such a high biomass or amount with very little nutrients. And that's what's very unique in Florida, is that you have that association. That's very unique. You only find those associations in Florida, some part of Mexico and Belize. And also, you also have this type of association up in Canada and north of the USA. But these are very remote and not exactly the same. All right, so scum is not always bad. It's actually from the university I used to work with at FIU, all right, where basically we put a website showing that, these algae are not bad algae. You don't want to kill them. They actually are very beneficial, and I will explain to you why they're so beneficial. So who's learned something here today so far? You knew they were good? Or actually, when you see those, you call the lake management and they say, I don't want to see them, you got to use copper sulfate because they obstruct my view and they look nasty.
So certain types of algae actually uptake nutrients?
Yes, they
like nitrogen?
Yes, actually these algae, they uptake nutrients and they also take phosphorus very well, and when they dry, during the dry down, they sequester the phosphorus and create limestone and do not release it when they get rewetted. So it's like a natural phoslock, if you want. Phoslock is a treatment to lock phosphorus in. And that's why the Everglades is so depleted of phosphorus, because these algae during the dry season, during the dry down, they actually sequester that phosphorus and don't release it. I actually have 2 papers published on this. And we use them in stormwater treatment areas, actually, around the Lake Okeechobee. Okay, so these are the good algae. And we put a show together with Clyde Butcher where we actually educate the kids. I'm trying to educate the people so that in the future they won't make the same mistake that their parents are doing. So that's my role as an educator, to do this. And basically we show them what periphyton is. And it might look nasty, but it's not nasty. It doesn't smell bad. It doesn't decay. It decays, but it doesn't smell bad when it decays. And when it decays, actually it helps the lake. It actually, when it dries out especially. All right, so this is what it looked like as a close-up. As you can see, it's a mat. Looks like a very spongious mat. It's not thin. It actually can be very thick. And you can see it's not one algae. I'll see you some example of the bad and the ugly algae to contrast with. But you can see that here, you actually have different layers of algae, and depending on where you are inside the mat, you have different types of algae. All right, and that's what it looks like underwater, and this is what it looks like when it's floating on the surface. And the reason they float on the surface is because they trap bubble during photosynthesis. Remember, they make oxygen, and when they make too much of oxygen, the oxygen dissolving in the water gets into non-dissolved oxygen, so oxygen gas, gets trapped into that matrix, which is like a sponge, and then they come up to the surface. I have a little animation to show you this in a minute. If you really want to know more about why the Everglades system is so unique and why this algae, this periphyton, is so important to the system, I highly suggest you read that review, which is a very comprehensive review on the Everglades, generally speaking, but also there is a strong emphasis on the periphyton, that healthy algae.
What's the life cycle of the algae? I mean, does it live for X?
I need to speak closer to you.
Repeat the question.
Oh, so the question is, what's the cycle of these algae? All right, that's actually something I'm studying right now. It looks like they do have a cycle, and we're not entirely sure of what triggers a cycle. But generally speaking, they grow very well starting in March. All right, March, April. They grow very well until the late rainy season, and they can actually go through several cycles. They actually, when they detach themselves from the ground, so from the bottom of your system, they get to the surface, and eventually they will sink back down to the system and rest on the bottom and be recycled down there, and also create marl as well, which is a calcium carbonate-based soil. And we don't really know what happened at the end of the rainy season, and it's something I'm studying right now. It looks like there is a collapse of that mat, and they become very crumbly. They don't really hold tight together. And several people have made an assumption that it was because of the nutrients, that as your system, the water gets more concentrated because you have evaporation at the end of the dry season, of the rainy season, then the algae will collapse, and proved that's not true because they tried to load with nitrogen. That was not entirely true. And what I'm trying to see now is actually it looks like the temperature is what makes them collapse. Like the first cold front especially looks like they affect them tremendously. So that's something we're looking at in my lab. And so during the winter, they're most of the time dormant. They're still there, but they're dormant. All right, so again, in the Everglades, or actually in your ponds here, which are mostly calcium carbonate-based pond, you need light, CO2, warm temperature, but paradoxically, again, very little nutrient, especially phosphorus. Okay, and this is something that is very unique, and you would never have the same response ever in the entire world, beside Florida and some of these wetlands that you have in Mexico and Belize. So this is something that's so how is it even possible? I think I gave you already some clues here, but when you look at it under the electron microscope, you can see it's a mixture of several different algae. So that's basically a electron microscopy. You can see that you have here diatom, you have cyanobacteria, you have green algae, and you have especially one alga though that is the foundation of that mat. All right, and it's called Cytonema hoffmanni. This cyanobacteria here. It can fix nitrogen, so it has actually a device that allows them to take the nitrogen from the air. So even if the system is depleted with nitrogen, it will be able to take it from the air. And that alga is very, very, very interesting because it makes that rebar kind of network like this, and it helps the mat to be very, very thick. So, if you don't have foundation, if you don't have rebar in a construction, everything collapses. Well, with these rebars, the entire system can stay erected, and they also have a sheath around them, and that sheath is made of calcium carbonate. And that's why it's so good at sequestering phosphorus, because that calcium carbonate will attract phosphorus. And phosphorus loves calcium carbonate when it forms. But not only this calcium carbonate sheath around the Cytonema hoffmanni, around the cyanobacteria, they also convey light, like fiber optics. And they convey the light from the surface of the mat down to very deep, and allow actually the algae from the very on the bottom of the mat to receive light, which normally they would not because of shading. But here they have these little vertical fiber optics that convey light to the bottom and allow these algae to grow throughout the entire mat. Normally, a mat thick like that should not happen because there is no light on the bottom. But because you have this cyanobacteria sheath, they actually bring the light down to the bottom. All right, so very unique system. And just I thought it was important to mention it because our lakes here, even if when they're healthy, it looks like they still turn like a nightmare for the homeowner because they don't like to see that proliferation of algae. And then we'll see we have ways to control this naturally. That's why I mentioned this. All right, so it's too long. I'm gonna pass this. So again, this is the good periphyton, and this is why they float. Again, this little oxygen bubble. This is what they do on the bottom, as you can see. Start floating here. And the way they do that is that first they grow on the bottom until they become very thick, and when you have a lot of oxygen bubbles trapped into it, they start floating on the surface. And then they will venture into the open water. And this is generally what you guys don't like, is when they actually venture in the open water, because that's all you see. And we talked about design about ponds, and we looked at the most common design, which was these very convoluted ponds, where they're not very wide. You had that slide where you have the square pond and you have the one that actually is kind of convoluted. Well, it's very easy for the algae to actually reach the other side of the pond and cover it all, because it's not a lot of void to fill. Remember, because you have a lot of shoreline, and they love to grow on the shoreline where you have enough light. And when they come to the surface, then eventually they will merge on the surface, connect together, and they can. I have people calling me, "Oh, you could walk over it." I say, "Well, no doubt, because the shoreline from one to the other is maybe 50, 60 feet. So that's easy for these algae to go from one side to the other." All right, so there is also some design that help these algae to be really problematic. All right, so here you have actually a algae mat because they also love to pair with Chara. Chara again is that algae that looks like a plant, and they can grow and go on the surface and create this very, very large, tremendous mat like this. All right. So this is also what it looks like, and a lot of people call me, okay, I think people just, threw dog poop in the water. Well, that's not actually it. We call them sweaters. All right, and basically what happened is in system where there is not enough nutrient in the water, the algae will steal the nutrient from the plant. So they will grow around the plant, kind of smother it, all right, and the plant will leak nutrient as they smother it, and they will steal this nutrient because there is not enough in the water. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a question since we love quizzes here. What do you think the nutrients are in most concentration in a very low water nutrient concentration? Let me rephrase this. In the system where you don't have a lot of nutrient in the water column, where do you think you find the most nutrients? Not in the air. Well, around the plants, if you can manage to steal the nutrient from the plant, but there is also another very, very easy source. What do you think that'd be? On the bottom, yes, on the bottom. All right, so you find this when you have low nutrient in the open water. These plants will basically grow on the bottom and around these plants to be able to get the nutrient out of them. All right, so that's why they grow on the bottom, and to have this happen, the water needs to be clear. All right, so this is another good, and I know you don't like to see this picture. So how can we actually manage to prevent this algae to grow so much, especially in the shallows of the ponds? Well, planting. We've talked about planting all the time. Generally, when people have problem with this plant, it's because they don't have any planting on the shoreline. All right. Again, the shoreline is where you have very shallow water. So you have a lot of light penetration. Even if your lake is turbid, you're still going to be able to grow in the shallows, right? So if you have no plants, you have no competition between the algae here, the good algae, and the plants. If you have the plant will shade out your algae naturally. And even if they don't do it completely, they will prevent the periphyton, these algae, when they start floating, to reach the open water. Okay, so here we have an example here where this is a pond by my neighborhood. I know you don't like cattail, so we'll think about the cattail not there. But you have spike rush, and you have actually the periphyton that cannot grow here. And when it grows, it's actually still the growth is restricted to the shoreline because spike rush act like little rakes like this, and they prevent the algae from getting into the open water and eventually completely cover it. Because that's one way to control it. The other way, if your pond is let's say, very shallow all around, the other way is to make the water more turbid artificially by using dyes. All right. So if you know exactly the volume you have, and you can actually calculate how much dye you need to put to prevent the algae to grow on the bottom, in the center of your pond. I'm not talking about the littoral zone here because that doesn't work in the littoral zone. You need to have plantings to have this happen. Okay. So that's pretty much what I always tell the people. There's a good algae, and this is one way to control them. And if you don't, and if you kill them with copper sulfate or any other algicide, what happens is you're creating a mass murdering, and they will release a lot of nutrient when you do this. When they die naturally, you actually have them not releasing nutrient because it's a slow process of decaying. But when you actually kill them very quickly, you have a release of nutrients. And when you repeatedly do that, you're killing the algae, and you're also killing the collateral effect. Remember the other wildlife that's around the zooplankton that eat the algae, and you're also killing the mollusks that eat the plants. So basically, you're defenseless against, algae growth and especially the algae growth and the plants if you don't control them. So you're hooked up to algaecide or herbicide. All right, so this is another example here where it's heavily planted here. And how much time do you have still? 10 minutes, yes, that's perfect. And you can see that they're all around here. So, another way to have a lot of algae in Florida, okay, so and I don't want you guys to miss the turn here. I told you that you have a low a low concentration in terms of nutrient in your water, and you have in Florida, paradoxically, compared to the rest of the world, all of these algae, which are good algae, and you want to keep those, or you want to mask the growth of them. Okay? And the planting is one way, and the dyeing the water is another way. Now, you also have another problem is when you're loading a system with nutrient, and then it's actually a universal rule. When you're loading the system with nutrient, you're getting to the nasty algae bloom. And I say algae bloom here because there will be one species blooming. Okay, so it's a total different matter than what we've seen. I hope you'll see the turn here. All right, so this is what I talk about the spraying to control your algae. So whether you're spraying and you kill your algae and they release nutrient and you're enriching your lake with nutrient like this, or you actually have a direct input of nutrient, or both, you have input of nutrient and you're doing the spraying, you're loading your system with nutrients. All right, and what happened, I'm going to pass this a little bit more, we're getting to the bad algae. And I'm going to go to the different type of algae now, and you'll see the contrast between the good and the bad and the ugly. All right, so this is an example of a monospecific, one species of algae that bloom. It creates also mats, but you can see it's one algae. It's a green algae here, Pitophora, or horsehair algae. All right, and you've seen this probably in most lakes actually of Naples. They have those. They're not the healthy periphyton, and when they decay, they do smell really bad, and they don't sequester phosphorus when they decay, like the good algae. Difference between the two, you see the good one here, several types of algae. Here it's only one type. So if you just go next to the water, pick it up, you'll see the difference. This one is very spongeous, like a sponge. This one is not spongeous at all. You know, it's mostly one alga blooming here. And it can suffocate your system when they decay. Take a lot of nutrient, oxygen when they decay. All right, there's another one here, blanket weed or cladophora. Can also grow in the ocean, depending on the species. And, there's also one alga, it's a green alga. Generally, the green algae are not the ugly. They do smell bad when they decay, though. All right, and then you have Spirogyra. All right, so again, that's actually a lake in Naples. You see, it's one alga blooming. And this is a good one as a contrast. You see the bad one is a good one, you see. None of these green algae produce toxin yet. So we'll get to the toxin in a minute. All right, so here we get into the blue-green algae. Again, these are cyanobacteria, so they are, bacteria that actually can photosynthesize. They have a pigment, they have chlorophyll to be able to capture sunlight and do photosynthesis. All right, and this is a map that shows you, where you have, bad taste and odor and toxin occurrence. Florida is one of the main places where you have this toxic algae bloom, especially toxic. All right, and you've seen that picture already. So that's microcystis. It's a very, very tiny alga, and it floats on the surface. And when it does that, it completely blocks all the sunlight, so they compete with all the other algae. They're very good at taking nutrients, so they're very fast growing as well, and they're very toxic. And generally 43% of the algae bloom toxics that we see in Florida are linked to that Microcystis aeruginosa. From my lab, we also extract that alga, and it releases chemical in the water to kill the other algae. It has an algae side that kills the other algae, all the competitors. And to some extent plants as well. So we extracted, the toxin, we expose it to different algae, and they die. They can't compete with that guy.
What's that?
That's microcystis.
No, but the one that you said that competes.
That's the one, the microcystis. When we actually grow the alga into a flask, and we filter out the algae, and we take that water, and we expose at a different concentration, different other strains of algae, it kills them. They don't grow. Yeah. So highly toxic also, we talk about it's hepatotoxic. Here you can see the control, and you can see the liver here with this mouse. So highly toxic. So the problem with fontaine, if you have a fontaine and you have an algae bloom like that, you're putting that mist of toxic algae in the air. Might not be a good way to be around the water if this happens. It's also highly persistent in the system even when the algae bloom is gone. Then you have the second one, Sandrospermopsis. We actually grow it at FIU. We sell pretty much a 1 milligram, costs about $6,000 to sell 1 milligram. It's very, very toxic. And we collect it from Lake Jessup and Lake Apopka over in Central Florida. and we grow them, but they're very, very, very toxic. They also can get the oxygen from the air, the nitrogen from the air as a source of nutrients. They make that cylindrospermopsin toxin, very bad toxin as well. Then you have anabina, and you can see all of these are very, very small microalgae, create scum on the surface. There's also the microcystin anatoxin, so that's nerve damage, and saxitoxin, that's nerves axon, so your nerve system. They also can capture the nitrogen from the air. They have a special cell here. So even if you don't have nitrogen, they'll get it from the air. So they compete with other algae by releasing chemical to compete with the other algae. They block the light because they grow on the surface, so the other algae cannot grow. And they're very good in taking nutrients. They grow very fast, and they can take the nutrient from the air if they don't have it in the water already. So as you can see, they're very, very good competitors. All right, then you have Planktotrix, which is a scum-forming one. All right, and you can see also toxic. Aphanism menum, Flossaque, so that's also another one. All right, it's much more rare here in Florida. And then Pseudospherium, which I've seen sometimes. So of course you don't want to have your dog drinking that water. Got some microcystin toxin, and Lingbia. If you live especially in a pond that's close to the water and to the Gulf, and the water is brackish, this is what you're going to see. And people very often confuse that with a good guy, but you can see it's very different. It's actually one alga blooming, and it smells very bad. It also can create some irritation on your skin, so it's a skin irritant as well. It's not that toxic in terms of killing you, but it does have some saxitoxin depending on the strain. Hope you see the difference between the good and the bad now. All right. So what do we do about all these stages? All right. I think we already talked about it. So why don't we use these slides? Or if you have questions, how do we control this? How do you want me to do it? I can go over and make a list, or we can make it very lively, and you can ask me questions how we control this. Two options. What do you guys prefer? The catalog, go over it. And then you write your question, and then you ask me? Okay, all right. So one way to, when you have an algae problem, the good algae, you have no problem, okay? But if you do have an algae with a bad algae problem, or the ugly one, the first thing you need to do is identify the source of nutrients. All right, some are very easy. Like we mentioned, if you have a culvert and you have water with nutrient getting into your lake, that's an easy fix. If your dog waste, that's an easy fix. If you're actually putting directly reclaimed water into your pond, I've seen this recently. I'm not going to cite the HOA. I mean, actually, it's several HOAs. They have 23 lakes and 32 acres of water, and they feed their pond directly with reclaimed water. That's disturbing. To maintain the water high. We can go over this. It's kind of a weird way to avoid sending the reclaimed water from the plant to the Caloosahatchee River. They send it to the detention retention pond, so that the detention retention pond clean it. But the homeowner don't like the water turning green, so they use copper sulfate, and now you have copper sulfate and the bad nutrient getting to the overflow box, getting to the Caloosahatchee River. I mean, this is nuts, right? But this is what's happening right now. Okay, so you do that. Then you have the diffuse, the sprinkler system, your fertilizer. So make sure you test your soil. You know exactly if your soil has everything. There is a problem that you have during the dry season with using reclaimed water to water the lawn. Okay? During the dry season, the grass needs more water. It doesn't need more nutrients. And the problem is that if you're using reclaimed water, it comes as a package, water and nutrients together. So that's a problem, because it means that during the dry season, you're going to load a lot of fertilizer into your lawn, right? Because you need the water, but not necessarily the nutrients. 1 minute, okay? And then when comes the rain, during the rainy season, everything goes to the lake. Problem. All right, so that's a way. How to remove the nutrients? Well, we talked about dredging. That's expensive. If you use a lot of copper sulfate, your sediment is unsafe to be handled, so it's expensive to dredge. And sometimes you can't because it's too toxic. You can hope for a good flush like we had last year, but remember, each time you have a good flush, that thing the problem gets out of your problem, out of your backyard, but it gets to the Caloosahatchee River or to the bay. So you're displacing the problem. You can use chemicals. Again, we're trying different chemicals, Foslock. You can use filtration with wetland. When you don't have room to have wetland filtration around, wetlands are very good to filter water. They're the kidneys of ecosystem. So you can use actually floating wetlands. So this is basically as the plants on floating mats that we've seen. You can rake the mats. If you rake them, you're removing nutrients. The mat have nutrients in them, you're removing them, and you can eventually compost them. All right? Or you can continue, using algaecide, but it just exacerbates the problem. They don't really fix it. It's a band-aid, but it doesn't really fix the problem. All right? I think I'll stop here because pretty much it's overlapping here. These are other options. I'd rather have questions because I'm sure you have some. Yes. Questions.
Could you talk about using dyes? I think this is the first time I've heard of this.
Well, the nursery might not like dyes because it might kill also the beneficial plants. It's a very hard. It's a balancing act.
Correct, but the dyes is actually. Yeah, it's a chemical that is inert, so it's not going to be providing more nutrients. It shades the light, and then they come in different colors. Blue, and have you ever seen a pond that is blue? Well, it's artificial. You die, I know it's so artificial that it really blows my mind. It's like the natural color of the water is olive green. Okay, that is the natural color, olive green, or it could be translucent, like. Completely transparent, Any algae will give us some coloration, but the blue dye, I don't know.
Well, one of the reasons they use blue dye is because, photosynthesis, especially for organisms that use chlorophyll, absorb into the blue and the red. Now, we could use blue and red. The problem is that if you use red, or if you use very, very dark dyes, your lake will also absorb too much heat from the sun, and the water, as it warms up, can trigger algae bloom, especially the cyanobacteria, which likes very, very hot water. So blue is the one that looks like absorbs the less heat because you're into the blue and then the UV, and blocks the most efficient wavelengths in terms of the light is made of several colors, and blue is one that you block. So these dyes will prevent the algae from growing, especially on the bottom of the water, and also to some extent in the open water. But you got to remember, these open water algae, they always cycle through. So the bottom algae are the ones that are fixed on the bottom, so they don't have the luxury to go get their light on the surface. Yes.
You don't think my lake's ugly?
I have an opinion
about it. Too blue.
But you're deep enough.
Yeah.
So it's going to be dark.
Yeah.
And then that shades the color of blue.
I use something called crystal blue, and I only put in 1 quart, I think, a week, unless it rains. But it makes it, it's not blue, but it's dark. It's just dark rather than olive.
Can be a little bit like indigo blue, a little bit turning to the indigo. Yeah. Kind of black blue. Some homeowners like it actually.
In fact, I like that kind of indigo color because it's like it's not the bluish like a swimming pool kind of look.
But it's non-toxic. It's actually organic dyes, the one you use in your food coloring. It's food coloring dyes. That's what it is.
It doesn't.
No, it's inert. There is no NMDS with it. It's very safe to handle. It doesn't damage much your ecosystem.
So I just have a follow-up question. So is it like the first step in making your pond healthier, or once you pick using a dye, you're always stuck using a dye? I mean, can you use it to help correct your pond?
Yes, you can use it as a transition as you're removing the nutrients, whether you're using, demucking the lake, meaning removing the muck, or you're using chemical, or you're using aerators, or floating islands, which are, again, still experimental. All of these are valid. Now, with floating island, for my research, I think I can announce it now, I have a student working on this, and we found that, we had a paradox. Mike Bowers uses this floating island very much, and normally BMAT recommend 20-25% of the lake being covered by this floating island, and Mike Bauer generally put 0.5 to 1, maximum 2%, and we see an improvement. So the question was, why do we see an improvement while there is only 1 or 2% covered? And they don't remove much nutrients, because I measured it. And I said, well, you need at least, 20 or 30 years of treatment like this to remove the nutrient in your lake. So one of my students looked at this island, and we had two basic hypotheses, or three actually. One is that these plants, they're grown hydroponically. They're not really actually aquatic plants. They actually are regular plants. But their roots normally are in the ground. And plants, when their roots are in the ground, they compete with each other by releasing what we call allelopathic compounds, so xenobiotic compounds, to compete with the enemy or the competitor. And it's the first time that these plants are actually put in open water with their root hanging in the water. So what my student did is she cut the roots, she extracts, the toxin that's there eventually, and we tested on different algae. And it stopped the growth of these algae. So they actually are making the natural algaecide. Don't write it yet. It's still concealed. We were going to write the paper, but basically it looks like they're releasing xenobiotic in the water that actually kills the algae. And the second thing is that we wanted to see if they were harboring zooplankton. And we were very, because the zooplankton like to hide out in the vegetation and the root system. You have actually this plant above the water, but it's like an iceberg. You actually have 3 or 4 times as much root down there. And we didn't find any zooplankton. Why? We were so disappointed. We just got the result yesterday. No. Probably copper sulfate. 0 zooplankton in the open, because we had the control. We had the zooplankton in open water, zooplankton underneath the mat, 0 in both. That's alarming. Very alarming. And we're going to try to do that in all the ponds that Mike Bauer is using and test this. And I think we got a paper as well here, because that's very alarming. It means that you have no defense for phytoplanktonic algae.
Interesting. Okay, thank you so much. Please have a pause. Appreciate that. All right, Susie, yes. Okay, we're going to go into the next planting. Oh, you have to. While Liz is putting together the technical part here, let me warn you about one thing about the dye that I didn't say. Be careful. Be careful. If you put that dye right away, you might create an oxic condition and then a non-photosynthetic condition, and then the algae will die and it will crash. Oxygen will go down by putting the dye and making it darker. Okay.
Let's do a quick pop quiz.
Pop quiz.
What percentage less fertilizer do you have to use if you're using reclaimed water for irrigation?
Wow.
How much less fertilizer do you need if you're using reclaimed water for irrigation?
0.
Good job. I got a lot of winners. I'm going to need more prizes.
0. The zero.
So if you use reclaimed water, you don't need to use fertilizer.
Reclaimed water, no fertilizer.
So you're using reclaimed water during the no fertilizer ban time. Which one? What happened?
That's interesting. Your lawn wins by using the reclaimed water instead of fertilizer.
Liz is going to have to tell me next slide.
During the rainy season, you shouldn't be watering anyway. You shouldn't be using your reclaimed water because you're getting enough rainfall alone. Thank you.
Yeah. Right.
Are we ready to go?
Yes.
All right. My name is Sue Scott. I'm substituting for Kathy Loyola today, so I'm somewhat familiar with the presentation, but I am familiar with the idea. For our purposes, the transition zone is that area from, next slide, from your lanai to the littoral zone. And what we've been talking about today is a lot of cooperation between stakeholders and residents. I love this picture because I am a cat person. Look who's on top. Just saying. Who's smarter, cats or dogs? I think we know the answer. But it does take cooperation between everybody in order to make good things happen. Next slide. So now we're talking about planting your transition zone with appropriate plants. Go ahead. What are appropriate plants? Well, most transition zones from that edge of your lanai to the littoral zone where those wetland plants are, in most places 20, 30 years ago were planted with Floratam turf grass. Okay?
Not a good choice of plant for that zone for many reasons. We're going to cover that. Florida native plants, they do great. In spite of the fact that the soil your house is on is probably dug up from way below and is not native to your site, it's still the kind of soil that the right kind of native plants are used to. We do have native plants that love sand with low nutrients, just like those native algae, which are so important to the health of your pond. You'll notice a theme here in Florida. Everything depends on low nutrient load, not high nutrient load. Water type, whether it's fresh, brackish, or salt, you do need to know that when planting your zone, whether it's transitional or littoral. Sunshade conditions. If a plant loves shade, it does not like growing in full sun and vice versa. Cold tolerance and heat tolerance. This is a tough one because our climate is changing. I've lived here 48 years. Trust me, things will never be the same. Winter is not the same. I am now recommending to people when they come to the nursery where I work that they look for natives that have a wider range of tolerance of temperature, something native to zones 8 or 9 through 11, because we're having extremes of heat and cold. Or non-native plants that are not invasive, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to focus on natives. Next slide. So the transition zone in nature is just slightly above that water line to our upland areas. But for practical purposes of this talk, again, it is the edge of our lanai down to that littoral shelf of the pond. Go ahead. What are the benefits of planting that transition zone with something other than turf grass? Keep in mind that this whole love of turf grass is left over from the 1800s and England and wealth and look what I own. The paradigm, I believe, of what constitutes a beautiful landscape is changing. We now are seeing more and more landscapes, including within HOAs, laws can be changed, where the landscape is planted with plants that are beautiful, and that this is now what's accepted and considered attractive. So that you can use the right plants to beautify your landscape. Erosion is a huge, huge problem. Plant roots help solve that problem. Here's the biggie. Eliminate the need for fertilizers and pesticides by using the right plant in the right place. Thank you, Dr. Thomas, for your work. I mean, I have been feeling throughout this program so far very sad. After watching that Awaken video, I mean, I get very emotional about this. This is my home. And it's so good to see science backing up what many of us already know intuitively. Again, in Florida, for healthy landscapes, you need less nutrient load. And we do not have 365 days of growing season in Florida. We have 4 months of growing season in Florida during the rainy season. Plants do not grow during the dry months. They survive. We've got to stop pouring fertilizer on everything to fix it. That's a big issue. Prevent waste from entering the water. Pet waste is another biggie. Our own waste. What do we have control over? We have control over ourselves, our behavior, our HOAs, our city councils, our pets, and our children. We have control over them. Reduce that nutrient load into your pond. Today we've been talking about how to fix the problem, because that's how America works. Here's my question. What if the problem never existed to begin with? That's the focus I'm going to take. And we provide habitat for wildlife, including mosquito-eating critters, which is always good. Okay. I think that's a real pretty picture. I really do. But here's the problem with it. You see right at the water's edge, everything's planted and how beautiful it looks. What do you see just above that edge? Turf grass. What do you think people put on that turf grass, whether it needs it or not? Fertilizer, whether it needs it or not. All the nitrogen in the world will not make that grass green. Iron makes it green. just so you know. Perceived negatives of planting your transitional zone. It'll look weedy. Only if you plant a weedy plant. Block the view of the pond. Only if you plant a line of plants right along your view. Attract unwanted wildlife. A lot of studies have shown that those alligators that everyone's terrified of, they like to come up where there's no plantings because it's easier for them. So just a little hint there. Next slide. Without even looking at all the information, let's just forget all the science just for a moment. Which one do you want to live next to, the one on the left or the one on the right? The one on the right, because it's pretty. That's the one that's going to increase your property value. That's the one that's going to make people keep coming back and keep our economy growing, not the one on the left. That's where all the problems are. We need to plant these ponds and mimic nature. We need to plant that littoral zone, and we need to plant the transition zone. Next slide. How do I determine the right plant for the right place? Again, using those Florida native plants, you have to understand what you have. Do you have shade, sun? Do you have a space of only 5 feet? Well, then you don't plant a plant that gets 20 feet wide. It really is that simple. Do you want to add color? Do you want to attract wildlife? Do you want all of the above? I know I do. So which plants are going to meet your desires? Go ahead. There are bulletproof plants. There are plants in Florida, native to South Florida, that go, sun, no problem. Hot, no problem. Sand, okay. Too much water? All right, I'll live through it. There are plants that can handle that. There really are, and they're beautiful. And grasses. I always encourage people to use grasses to soften the landscape, to soften all the hard edges we create. These are beautiful plants. Go ahead. Shrubs. Cocoa plum, Florida privet, 2 of my favorites. Absolutely amazing plants. How about the cabbage palm, sable palm? That's our state tree. It's gorgeous. It can go from wet to dry. Doesn't care. Loves it all. Go ahead. No matter what you plant, you must prevent soil and mulch from entering the water. So that's a biggie. Go ahead. Sunshine mimosa is actually being used as an alternative to turf grass. Not so much in developments, but individuals throughout Southwest Florida are going to this. It looks like Horton Hears a Who, that little powder puff, little Whoville. Butterflies can't get enough of it, and I've actually seen Cassius blues laying their eggs on it, so it's pretty amazing. Thickest in full sun. It does die back a little in the cold winter, but it rebounds quickly. Go ahead. Matchstick, Phyllonotiflora, also known as Creeping Charlie. It's not a weed. This is the answer to your problem in your swales. This plant loves to get wet. And guess what? 3 species of native butterfly lay their eggs on it, and they all love to nectar on it. It gets this high. You don't need turf grass. If you combine that with some sunshine mimosa, you're done. And you never have to mow again. Go ahead. This is what happens when you mix 3 things together. Non-native perennial peanut, sunshine mimosa, and Phyllonotiflora. You get green that you can walk on, do anything to, never mow, attract butterflies, never fertilize, and you're done. Okay? Another great plant for that transition zone that allows you to see the water. I know that's a big issue. Quailberry. It only gets like 6 inches tall. This tall. Plant this in a mulch plant bed, boom, you're done. And the birds will love you. Okay. Golden creeper, which we have right out front here. And it's actually been turned into a mini hedge. Something I personally hate doing to plants. But what's cool about this plant, it only gets a couple of feet high. You can actually do it, and it looks great. It makes a little tiny mini hedge. This is actually more of a beach plant, but it can tolerate the parking lot out here where it's hot and miserable and exhaust and no fertilizer, no care, and no water, and it looks like that. How amazing. Go ahead. Here we've got a combination, sunshine mimosa instead of turf grass, golden creeper for a mini hedge, and everything looks very manicured. That does not look weedy or unkempt. It looks like somebody cares. Go ahead. Okay, this guy can get out of control. Beach dune sunflower is a dune plant. It's used to growing in sand with extremely low nutrients, very little detritus. One plant will get 5 foot in diameter and about 2.5 feet high. Buy the mailbox. You only need one. You got to trust me on this. But if you have a community with an area where it's sandy and nothing else will grow, and people want some green, here you go. The only problem is at the end of summer, it looks kind of crappy because it actually hates water. You can kill it by watering it too much. So you cut it back, you get another whole year out of it, then you go and pull it up, babies are underneath and ready to go. So if you have a sandy cul-de-sac, for example, nothing else will grow there for you, put in a couple of those. And it's gorgeous all winter long. Here we have a bit of a transition zone planting. There's still turf grass in the back, but they've put in some beach dune sunflower, looks like some other non-natives, looks like dwarf golden dewdrop, some grasses, but it looks nice. And best part of all, if they just stop fertilizing the grass altogether, they're not adding any nutrients to that canal. Go ahead. 2 more great plants for very sandy, sunny areas, beach morning glory and the railroad vines. They will grow a lot. But they're beautiful. Ipomoeas, absolutely gorgeous. Go ahead. Here's someone who has a combination of, instead of lawn, sunshine mimosa, golden creeper for a hedge, and railroad vine down near the canal front. No fertilizers are being used whatsoever. None. Think of the cost savings. Never mind the environment. Think of the cost savings. And they're not cutting. Okay, go ahead. Blanket flower. Looks good with dune sunflower. Again, native Florida wildflowers are no different than native wildflowers in Illinois. They have a shelf life. Wildflowers are annuals. They don't last forever, so please don't expect them to. Go ahead. Seaside goldenrod, great for butterflies. If you want to help the bees, put this plant in. Okay. Sea oxeye daisy. Sea oxeye daisy. It's found in those areas, and it looks beautiful. Go ahead. Here we have a mixture of tropical sage, blue porterweed, and pencil flower. All nicely sculpted, looking very formal. No fertilizer needed here, folks. None. Okay. So again, it's not just about the littoral zone. It's about transitioning from the water's edge to our back doors is where we need to start putting in more of those plants. Right at that intersection, sand cordgrass. That's the grass you see in the high-end developments. $700,000 homes. They're using sand cordgrass, a Florida native grass. Thank you. And depending on, there's so many different kinds of developments out there. Many of them actually have beaches now. Sea oats. That'll hold everything in. No fertilizer needed here. Go ahead. Here we have the Charlie Rice on the left there, standing underneath a limbed up cocoa plum. Cocoa plum is not a 4-foot tall hedge. It is a 15-foot tall shrub or small tree. That's how it's supposed to look. You can hedge it, but in a few years it will look like crap because it's been butchered. Okay, I'm not going to mince words here. The truth is, if you trim a plant more than 20% of its mature height, you're killing it. So if a plant naturally gets 10 feet tall and you're pruning it less than 8 feet, you're killing the plant. That's not me, that's just science. Okay. So again, Florida privet is one of my favorite plants. You will find, I've seen it growing wild on Sanibel. Gorgeous shrub, stays smaller, 10 by 10, great hedge, great privacy hedge, great protection from storms. I should know mine protected me from Hurricane Charlie, and it can be hedged. You'll see on all these slides it says can be hedged. I'm a proponent of understanding and appreciating plants for their natural form and function. So please try to go unhedged to begin with. Thank you. Go ahead. Myrcene, another great plant. Under harsh conditions, this plant still does well and performs. Again, mulch only. Whatever the tree trimmer trimmed that day, mulch 3 inches to the drip line of your plants, and you're done. Okay. Saltbush, 5 minutes. Okay, we got to keep moving. Saltbush, absolutely gorgeous. If you have brackish water, here you go. Go ahead. White indigo berry, actually a very drought-tolerant plant. Go ahead. Cabbage palm, Florida state tree. Unless it gets a direct hit, do not hurricane cut these trees. Or actually, it's a grass. Do not. You should never, ever, ever trim green off of any palm tree. Ever. You're killing the plant when you do that. It will sway in the wind and do just fine in a hurricane. Okay. Cypress trees, again, more for the water's edge. Go ahead. Slash pine, or as I prefer to call them, future bald eagle nesting sites. And it will attract them. Beautiful plants that grow best in at least 3 because they communicate chemically under the ground. Dr. Thomas brought up the plants releasing chemicals to outcompete other plants. They know their own kind. And in Florida, we create plant communities. Plants that are used to living together and are healthier because of it. Okay. Green and silver buttonwood can also be limbed up as a tree. When you're limbing up, you're not killing the plant as when you're hedging down. Okay. Sea grape, great choice, not only on the beach but a little further inland. Does really, really well. And you can take some branches out and see through it to see your lake. Go ahead. Here we have trees trimmed up so people can still have their view. They still have shade. Unfortunately, they still have turf grass. Monitor and maintain your planted transitional and littoral zones. Weed, weed, weed until plants are established. No irrigation and no fertilizer does not mean no maintenance, unfortunately, because these are managed landscapes. It's not nature. Watch for invasive exotics, and go to the next page. Here we go, beautiful view. A little more what I call a real Florida skyline. The important question I have for everybody today is this. We now know that these Florida plants that are healthy and a natural part of your ponds require less nutrients. In the middle of the night, is there somebody running to Home Depot and buying bags of fertilizer and just dumping it in your pond? No. So where's the fertilizer coming from? Who's putting fertilizer in your transition zone? We are. So we made the decision to fertilize that turf grass, even though it doesn't need it. Trust me, it doesn't. It's not making it up. I'm getting my information from turf grass experts. If we're the ones deciding to fertilize, can't we be the ones to decide not to? End of my session.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. If you have any questions for Susan, she will be here around. We're going to go quickly into one little video, and I promise this video is only 17 minutes, so it's a short. But the good thing about this video is that it's 3 statements from volunteers, citizens who have problems in their ponds, and they have done some solutions. And you'll see the 3 presentations, and they're already, ready to go.
Stormwater ponds are engineered devices created to manage water from storm events, preventing flood and reducing runoff pollution. But as any man-made structure, they require maintenance to prevent them from becoming unpleasant and extending their functions. In this video presentation, we show 3 examples of actions taken by citizens like you to improve the conditions of their stormwater ponds in their communities.
Okay, my name is Herb Schuckman. I live in the community of Island Walk, which is a community of 1,856 homes spread out over 700 some odd acres. We have 30 interconnected ponds that we have had problems with, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about our experiences. Going back to the year 2010, when my committee took over were appointed to take over the study of the lakes, we became very concerned because we found that, number one, the large bass were getting less and less each year. The amount of filamentous algae tended to increase every single year and was getting to be more and more of a problem. We were using more and more copper sulfate in the water to try and control the algae blooms. We found that there was occasionally a little odor coming out. The water had lost its clarity and had more turbidity, and we realized that we had a problem. And so we went to the board in September of 2010 and said that we have a problem and we really have to start investigating what to do about it and to come to some solution. We found that our oxygen saturation levels had fallen down drastically, and that we had reached a point where the larger bass would not be able to survive. That what happens is that as nutrients come into the water, the bacteria normally present in the water break down the nutrients and cause the material to be taken care of. But when there's too much nutrients, then what happens is the bacteria work and they use up the available oxygen. When the oxygen is used up, the bacteria then die. And then you get a buildup of material that settles on the bottom as muck. And you find also that you get a lot more filamentous algae because of all the nutrients in the water. You find that your clarity of water breaks down because of all that buildup of this material. In the first few years, everything seems to look wonderful, seems natural. There's fish, everything is doing well. In the year 4 to 5, we found that, after studying this, we found that you start to see that you're getting more and more algae blooms. You're using more and more chemicals every year to try and control it. You're finding that your water is starting to get a little more turbid. As the years go on and you get into years 6 and 7 and 8, you start to see even more of the above, and in some cases you start to discover odor formation that becomes sort of difficult for people to deal with. We believe, in all due honesty, that the implementation of the aeration system is responsible for probably at least 85 to 90% of our success. However, we don't know that. We just believe that. We know that the things we have done have given us a tremendous improvement. We have found that we have accomplished an awful lot. Our ponds, the water clarity is increased dramatically. Our muck levels was estimated by South Florida Water Management, by an expert from there, to be probably 2 to 3 inches deep in a community our age, which was 10 years basically at the time we did the aeration. When we sent down divers, which we did, we found that those depths were actually 12 to 30 inches. And in 17 months, we have reduced it 52% just because of what we did to date. So our muck levels have actually dropped 52%. And this is one of the things you have to be very concerned about. That's what's filling in your ponds, that plus the erosion factors. And one of the reasons the ponds have to be dredged every 25 years. You can do many things like we've done, which really should add another 20 to 25 years to that life before we'll have to dredge. We feel that the lakes and ponds, as they are doing much, much better. We see that all of our residents are really behind it and have supported us 100% of the way. And they all remark all the time about how much better the lakes and ponds look now than they used to look in the past. We have come to one conclusion, and that is the days of just looking at perfect grass meeting perfect water really can't exist in nature. When you have that, you'd have a situation that is going to break down. It's just a question of how long, when, and where.
Hi, I'm Joan Justice. I'm in Palm Island. This was a project of ours to help save this little lake. This is a little lake. I live on the big lake. We were losing our shoreline really bad. When the rains came, you could see the lands wash away, and the waving action would erode the shoreline, and we were losing it, and the pond was getting shallower. So we decided to try to save the shoreline by putting 2 rows of rock at the control level, and then planting plants. So far we have just about all of the houses done except 2. The homeowners are paying for it, and it usually costs them like $250 just for their frontage. Because we're doing it ourselves, it's a lot cheaper that way. The landscapers put it down. County doesn't allow rickrack, but they said that we could use the 2 rows of rock, and we're calling it a border. So then we're planting plants below that, and it's a definite line where the landscapers will stop and not keep cutting the plants down, and the erosion will stop because the rocks are holding back the erosion. And so far it's working out well. Most of these plants I've started from seed, so it hasn't been expensive for us to do the plantings. Well, there's duck potatoes. There's little clutches of duck potatoes, and then the water cannas, the yellow water cannas. They're in groupings, and then the irises, the water irises, those are purple. And I did put some bog lilies in here. It's hard to get the seeds from the bog lilies to start those. But as I collect them and start them, we put them over here. But we're putting everything that blooms, things that bloom. The board was all for this in the beginning, but some of the homeowners objected to it. But as we've been working on it, they've all come around, and they see the purpose behind it and how nice it's looking. So they're getting in on it too, and we've had quite a few donations for some of the property, some of the common property, but most of the homeowners have taken it upon themselves to put the money in and buy the rocks.
My name is Larry Harvey. I'm on the Heritage Palms Community Development District. I'm a vice chairman. We have been involved here at Heritage Palms on the CDD since the takeover from the developer US Home back in 2005. And we found that we're probably faced with the same situation that many of the communities in Southwest Florida are finding themselves in now. And that is over the years, erosion has been affecting our shorelines. And the 2 principal ingredients for creating the erosion have been the wave action. This is where you have the high waves coming in off of the lake and then beating against the shoreline, and eventually over a period of time eroding away the shoreline. In many cases, sometimes threatening residential property that is adjacent to the lake shoreline. In addition, you also have sheet water runoff, which causes erosion. And this is the water runoff similar to what you think perhaps like with the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. The water accumulates in between the buildings on the low spots. The gutters that have the downspouts, they're all centered into one given location, and during heavy rain that water then forms, and as I say, like a little river, goes down and it washes out the shoreline down on the shoreline of the lake shoreline. So you have the two principal ingredients then for causing the erosion, and that is the wave action from the lake itself and then sheet water runoff. When the CDD came on board in 2006 after the turnover, and the CDD board was formed that is made up of residents from within the community, I being living here in Heritage Palms, we were asked by the developer US Homes to take over the operational permit from the South Florida Water Management District, which previously had issued the constructional permit to US Home. When we were asked to do this, we were looking at our lake shorelines, and we said These shorelines they have tremendous escarpment, the vertical drop-off on the lake shoreline. In other words, it's caused by the erosion. And we said there's many of the lakes out here that we don't think comply with the original permit, which requires that you have a 4-to-1 slope down to the shoreline, and then actually that 4-to-1 slope actually goes into the lake for a certain distance, and then it turns into a 2-to-1 slope as it goes out into the middle of the lake. Many of the lakes in with that escarpment and everything exceeded that 4-to-1 slope. And we said, we're not going to accept this permit because we're assuming all responsibility from U.S. Homes at that time. We then said, okay, what are the best methods for going ahead and correcting this shoreline? And there are many different ways of restoration as far as shorelines are concerned. The first one and the cheapest one that comes to mind is called basic restoration. And this is nothing more than bringing in some heavy equipment, putting a shovel or a scoop out into the lake, pulling it up to the shoreline, packing it down, shaping it, packing it, and then going ahead and putting sod on top of it. Unfortunately, U.S. Homes had done this about 6 months before we took over, before they turned it over to us. Within that 6 months, a heavy rain came, washed all the sod out, and the shoreline was back to its original state. So basic restoration is, while it's cheaper, it is a short-term solution to the problem as far as repairing shorelines. So with that, we said, okay, we need to find something else. The other alternatives that you have are riprap. And we have an example of riprap on this lake across the way, and it's very effective in certain areas. And so we utilize some riprap, very minor, and then we also have bulkheads. And we have an example of the bulkheads on this particular lake also that were put in by the CDD in combination with the Master Association. Again, this serves a specific purpose, but it's very expensive to do, and it's limited on how much you can do. For instance, the code for South Florida Water Management District says you cannot have a hard surface. Bulkheads and riprap are considered hard surface, and you cannot exceed 40% of the perimeter of a lake with a hard surface restoration. Lee County is they use 20% as their guideline. You cannot exceed 20% of a lake's perimeter in a hard surface. Lee County happens to consider geofilter tubing, which we're going to talk about, and that's the main purpose for why we're here this morning, is to learn about geofilter tubing, or as I'll refer to as GFT. And there is nothing more. I will show you that it is relatively inexpensive in comparison with the other two, the riprap and the bulkhead. Geofilter tubing process is one where they put a base bag down of a heavy, of a woven material, a plastic type woven material. They lay it out, they then put another smaller bag on top of that called the fill bag, which is of a woven material. They then, using a 3-man crew, will put a boat in the water. They will have a large diesel engine on that boat that is a suction engine, that they put a 8-inch pipe or flexible tubing into the lake at the surface. They'll take a diver in a wetsuit who goes down to the bottom of the lake with that suction hose, picks that sand and debris up off the bottom of the lake, comes back up through the boat. They then have a person up on the shoreline, and they have a hole in the base bag, just a little hole where they put that 8-inch tube in, and then they force all of that sand and debris into that bag, and they fill it up. And they can actually do about 300 to 400 linear feet a day by filling that bag up. And so they go all through the shoreline then filling that bag. They then come back and they take the fill bag, which is a smaller bag, and that's the bag that's the unwoven material. They fill that bag. After all that is done, they come back and they slit the fill bag, which is now filled with all sand and foam, or the contents of the bottom of the lake. They break that bag and then they spread it out, and it's almost all sand at this time. And that is where you're gaining back the 4-to-1 slope. And with that, once the sand is spread out and you've regained that 4-to-1 slope, they then bring in a sodding company who goes ahead and lays out, in this case, Floratam sod, and that covers all of the base bag plus the incline from the sand that forms the 4-to-1 slope, and that's what you see then is the sod that has been placed back on here. If U.S. Homes had gone ahead and put in littoral plants when they put this in, that we would not have had the escarpment that we have on all our lakes. This is something now that is required by code. Lee County requires it, and in 2005 the city of Fort Myers required it. At the time that U.S. Homes built this complex, 1998 to 2001, the city of Fort Myers did not require littoral plants. They do now. I think that pretty well wraps up our exposure here to at Heritage Palms as far as the use of geofilter tubing, why we did it, where we did it, and some of the pluses and the minuses of geofilter tubing. I guess I would just like to conclude for communities who are finding themselves in a situation where they have escarpment on their shorelines and they're looking at it and it's threatening the property values and it's threatening the other aspects of their residential areas and other parts of their community, is to go ahead and you can contact South Florida Water Management District. Lee County, if you happen to be in an unincorporated Lee County, contact them. They have guidelines and suggestions as far as for restoration of shorelines. I think you will find that another integral part that should be emphasized, that if any type of restoration, that all the city and the county is recommending and encouraging and requiring by code the use of littoral plants. And so in our conclusion here with geofilter tubing, I'd like to put in that the littoral plants are an integral part of shoreline restoration and maintaining minimizing the effects of erosion during the future.
All right. Well, thank you. I want to thank those volunteers who did that talk. And the one thing that's common among all of them is that they work with the board. And the board allows them to do that. So it's an integral part that is working with the board because they're going to be putting the monies but they have to see that. They have to understand what is the benefit in the long term. It's not just like around the corner. In fact, the one thing, who maintains your pond? The HOAs, the CDDs. Find about that. I mean, the proper managing. I mean, these are intricate parts of that maintenance of the pond. And the pond has to be maintained no matter what. So that's one issue. The resource to assist your organization, well, the NEP has this micro grant. So right now we're working on a project, and along with the city, the county, the Division of Natural Resources, that are actually working with this. And we have some other projects like the WETplan, which is right now going on. You would like to add any more comments before we?
Well, this is the first time we've done this workshop presentation this way, so any suggestions that you have are very welcomed. Anything about rearranging the order in which we've done the presentations, information that you had hoped we would have addressed that we didn't, or if there's a topic that maybe we over-addressed, also let us know. There is a website that just went live that we're working on called WETplan.org, where we'll be putting these resources up there. The presentations were recorded today, and we've got the PowerPoint presentation. We will be matching them up, so if there's something that you want to go back, to refresh your memory, you have a question about, that should be up. It might be about a month. But on that wetplan.org, we will also have our information if you want to contact us directly if you have any questions. We would be happy, as other people have mentioned, to do shorter presentations to your HOA board, to your CDD, to your property manager, any of those sorts of things. Finally, I'd like to thank all of our presenters today and all of our cooperating partners. Without whom would not have been possible. So I think I've captured them all up there on the